Welcome to a new episode of the Creative Industry Insight podcast. I'm your host, Bobby. Today, we welcome VFX editor Casey Curtiss, who joins us to talk about his work on The Killer. Casey will walk us through what the role of a VFX editor entails and how those skills were used on The Killer. Please be warned, there are heavy spoilers in this episode. Now let's jump into the conversation with Casey. Hi, Casey. Thank you for joining me today.
Hi, thanks for having me.
I'm glad we managed to squeeze this in before the whole sort of Christmas break and catch you before your holidays. I'm glad that we could squeeze that in, and we're here to talk about The Killer, which has recently been released on Netflix. I was lucky enough to watch it at London Film Festival with a sold-out audience. So I think the film hit very, very differently in a packed audience than it would be in my living room.
I bet, yeah. Unless your living room is it's packed with an audience as well. Yeah, most of the time that I've seen it, it's just been by myself in my edit room. I've seen it once in a theater, and it was quite a different experience as well. So I'm glad you got to experience it that way.
Just to sort of like pick up on what you said, because you've seen certain scenes so many times and know how the film plays out in terms of beats for beats. How different is it for you, or instead of sitting in your edit room, compared to when you're in a packed audience and then you're just like, okay, we're gonna wait for this reaction right here for this moment, for the audience to laugh or audibly gasp or be like in awe of the scene.
Yeah, I've seen it in some. I've been working on this movie for about 2 years now, and I've seen it in a lot of different states, from dailies, all the edits with no visual effects, with final visual effects. So some when I watch it, I have memorable quotes from it that I laugh at that the audience never laughs at, because the joke of him saying interesting to the woman trying to sell him wealth management. That's a very funny scene to me, but it's probably only funny if you've seen it 20 times. And the audience instead laughs at jokes that I have never laughed at. And I've just seen it in so many different kinds of context that the quotes themselves, I was totally surprised by the real reactions versus my reactions. And then I watch it for the visual effects, and I can't really unsee certain visual effects, and I had extra scrutinize certain shots even on the big screen, and an audience probably doesn't even think twice about most of the shots.
Do you feel like that? Do you know what? This is like the perfect time to drop the quote that I have to live among the normies. That's what you're probably like when you're like, oh, I have to watch it along with the normies and see how it plays. I just want to before we sort of jump into the question I prepared, does that drive you a little bit crazy knowing that you've scrutinized over certain shots and then sometimes the audience member doesn't doesn't take notice, but then, or are you more like, all right, we nailed it because the audience doesn't notice, and that the fact that our work is so invisible they don't realize that that there's a certain scene as visual effects, how certain scenes have visual effects inserted into them.
Definitely the second one. I don't relate at all to the killer, and certainly not. I'm certainly one of the many as well. Yeah, I think that's a good thing in this case. Most of the visual effects that we do are meant to be invisible, and most visual effects, I would say in general, are meant to be invisible. There certainly are the superhero landing amongst the rubble of the city that even then, you don't want the visual effects to be on display. You want the story and the character and the setting and the color and the cinematography. You want nothing to be on full display. You want the movie to shine on its own. And for a movie like The Killer, we don't really have any visual effects that are wanting to stand out. And the fact that I can go through the movie and say what effect has been done on every shot that pops up is completely beside the point. And we work really hard to try to make it that way.
Okay, because I was speaking to another VFX supervisor, and he was talking about the visible work that we do. I should it was a visual effects supervisor, Pablo Hellman, who was saying that about the visible work and the work that they do to make sure that that people aren't taken out of it, and how important it is just for it to flow without you realizing, to be like, oh my gosh, you digitally inserted 100 cows in this scene and no one doesn't even realize. That must have been really painstakingly difficult as well.
Well, we certainly didn't have that many cows in our film, unfortunately.
Yeah, that's true.
But we did work with him on Mank. They did some elephants, some monkeys, and some giraffes for us.
That's another film that's incredible. Where I know we're slightly deviating, but yeah, watching the behind the scenes for that, because I spoke to production designer Don Burtz and how he created his world, and then the visual effects side of it. And it's just, even when you see the behind the scenes videos on YouTube, you think you even though things are fake, I think you can still get blown away by what you see on screen, but then also how people created it and how much detail goes in for you not to notice that it's fake. And it's just like, wow, this is incredible. But then also, I always think about, like, imagine if there was someone who watched films 100 years ago to then see what we can create now. Like, their minds would have been blown back then. Like, I would love to know what their minds must be like now if they saw it and they're just like, no, I can't compute this. This is incredible.
Yeah, and there's so many reasons to have specifically visual effects, like the brute scene. So many of the visual effects are done for safety, or some sort of car crashes that they might have done in the 70s that we do all digital now. It's to save the money on shutting down the highway and then crashing. How many takes do you want to do? Do you want to do 5 takes? We need 5 cars then to completely destroy and set up the rigging for it. And lives have been lost doing that. And so some safety aspect is important. It is definitely part of visual effects. And even on a movie like ours, where we don't have any car crashes, we're removing people on wires so that Sala can land on the stunt double without crushing him. And I don't know if you've seen the behind the scene. There's a video of the brute fight behind the scenes where it shows all the stunt choreography, and that kind of stuff is amazing. And I don't really think about it, and I just see, oh, we have 2 actors, we're gonna have to paint out these wires. But to hear their explanation of, oh, we're doing this because it's safer this way, or this is a very, very dangerous move, so we're gonna do it like this. It's just fascinating to hear everyone on top of their game, and Don Burt working with them to remove parts of the floor and make this part padded, and how it seamlessly is part of the floor until we reposition it, and then it's a visual effect shot. And all I know is, oh, okay, we just need to fix the floor here. But to hear the whole backstory of how it got there is really fascinating and sometimes lost on us.
I think as well, like audience members, if we watch a scene where somebody, brute scene fight, as you're mentioning, yeah, there's so much that goes into something like that, where as an audiences, you don't realize how much planning needs to go in. And the fact that you need to remove this floorboard here, or put these wires here, that people will need to take out later on. But then also we need this padding here, because if somebody crashes through that, they can't actually crash through brick walls, because medical bills, and you're going to get sued for really hurting someone. And then the safety element of it all, it is pretty, like, mind-blowing, the amount that people need to prepare for just the day, but then also for what you guys have to do afterwards to create the final scene of the film. just to sort of jump in before we start talking about the film again, because you are the first VFX editor that I've had on the podcast. I'm curious, what is a VFX editor, and what role do they play in making the film?
So, VFX editor, there's it's a complicated answer. There's usually two kinds of visual effects editors. There's a visual effects editor that is on the vendor side for a VFX vendor. So ILM will have their own VFX editors, Olin will have their own. They usually deal with mini movies, mini shows, but only for that vendor. And they also tend to not be a union role, or they fall under a different union, hopefully. And then a movie or a show will have their own, sometimes their own VFX editor. And so I was the only VFX editor on the editorial side for Killer. And so I only deal with one movie, but I deal with all the vendors. And so not every movie or show will have a VFX editor. Might be a little controversial amongst them to say this, but I'd always think of a VFX editor as a specialized assistant editor. So a movie that doesn't have a large number of shots, visual effects shots planned, or doesn't have a large budget, the assistant editor will handle the role of a VFX editor. So an assistant editor is kind of editorial is the hub of post-production. They are they're the receiving from production. They are receiving communication from scripty and camera department and sound, and they are editing the movie, but they're also sending out what we call turnovers to the sound, to score, to color, and to visual effects. And they're also receiving these things back, except for color correction, if depending on what the pipeline looks like, is often just the one who delivers. So when you send out a version of the movie to sound, you're probably not doing that many turnovers. And when you are, you're doing the whole reel or the whole movie. If you're someone like Fincher's post crew, you are doing a lot of turnovers. And they're incremental and small, and they're able to start working on it earlier. But as far as visual effects, it's every shot that is done is a turnover, or if you think of them as a group of shots, that's the turnover that you send as a package to a vendor. And so it entails a lot of tracking, we sent these 10 shots to this vendor to do this kind of work on. We haven't received half of them back, or we've received all of them, but we had notes on these. And to keep track of all of that and to see how far along we are, that's, I think, most of the job. That's most of the job of the VFX editor. And during production, they also do temp VFX, which for us is mostly stabilization, but for an easy example is green screen, blue screen. It's a lot better to edit with some sort of temp. You put the background back there, and maybe you'll get direction saying the horizon is a little low on this, or actually the angle we'd be looking more at the dome of the Pantheon when it should be in the middle of the window on this angle. That kind of feedback we can then push to the VFX vendor, who will actually be doing the final shot, in this case, our temple, and they'll be able to have a better starting point, as well as anyone who views the film in its unfinished state, whether it's a director or the editor or a studio, they can see the film closer to its completion, even though the temp VFX is just going to be thrown away.
Like, I guess because when you mention stuff like temp VFX, I always think about the temp sound design that people put in, and how, like, I guess in VFX it's slightly different, as it's not really, it's like an indicator, but more than like just an indicator for as a way of you guys to work. But I think with something like The Killer, when we're watching certain scenes that are played out, it's amazing how much VFX has come into it. But then also where you're talking about how, the sky might be slightly lower. So I think the a really good. I know we're jumping here a little bit, but I think the opening scene of where we have Michael Fassbender sitting by the window and looking out onto the Paris streets, and even watching that, and how that was done and how much VFX went into that, which was crazy as well. How does that happen with a temp VFX? Because do you already have the plates in place for the temp VFX, and then you sort of just maneuver it around so that it becomes a completed version?
Yeah, that scene was wild, and that took a long time. Our temple did all of those. They have a wonderful reel that they posted, and I'm sure there's other reels coming from other vendors soon. I think they turned they delivered that reel within a week of the movie coming out. It's really fast. The first thing we had were the plates from Paris. That was our first shooting location, and they put, I believe, 6 cameras in one window, and they filmed a real courtyard, and they filmed it as plates different times of day, but then they also had action. So you see POVs of people walking around down there, the cat running in. That was all choreographed. That the first thing that we filmed, that they filmed, and we knew pretty quick that David wanted to redesign the architecture of the Target building's floor, in the entire floor. And we weren't certain if the whole building was going to be redesigned, and he wasn't quite able to find the right location that he wanted, but he had the general location. He had lots of ideas of, I want more of these kinds of buildings this way. I want the Pantheon, which is in the plate. I want it more centered, and I want it to look more like this, and more from this kind of angle. So we knew fairly early on that our temple was going to be doing a matte painting for us, and they've done matte paintings for us. I don't know how long they've worked with Fincher, longer than I have, and I've been there 8 years. So they do fantastic work for matte paintings, and they really had their work cut out for them, because not only did they make a matte painting for several times a day in this location, they had a long time to work on these matte paintings, but then footage came in of Michael Fassbender on the green screen, shot in New Orleans, where he is doing his acting, but then also the Target apartment, where it was shot on a stage, where all of them are doing their big their big scene, or the 3 scenes. And then Kirk Baxter, our editor, had the ability to cut back and forth. He can cut to a POV of what was going on, which sometimes became a scoped POV, or he could go on a wider shot, and he just had this the stage work small in the frame, and we would scale the background to match. Our temple would then know, oh, okay, these are the kinds of shots we're going to be working on later. But of course, we do a lot of splits, so it might be one take of Fassbender on an over the shoulder, with the left side of the windows doing something and the right side of the windows doing something from another take, or something from later on in a take. So it was a very complex thing. There was speed changes, and I don't believe any rack focuses were added, but certainly tuned. And it was just all very complicated, and notes just kept coming in. And we finally got it to the point where it is now. But for my side of things, I turned all of this over, and we had to, my VFX producer, who's the post producer, he was asking, how soon can we turn this over? Should we turn it over with 1-second handles, with 8-frame handles? And once they had it more or less locked so that our temple could start working on it, it was difficult to turn over, and just having to communicate to them, use plate D from this time code to this time code, because it's this part of the window which is split out right above Fassbender's hand, and just making sure that what Kirk had done in the edit was communicated to visual effects. And when I received something back from them, that they had everything lined up, that they had done it properly, and that then David is watching it straight from what our temple is posting, and there he's able to give notes of I want the dome to be a little bit more in this position. I would like the banister on here to be perfect. I would want a reflection of this. I want the vintage glass to distort. And you can see in the reel just how many elements go into all of this. And then once I had enough of them, I would check them all and make sure that all the reflections were all in the same place, and make sure that the plants were all in the same location, and just making sure that technically the shot was all as perfect as David would want it to be.
When you're working on something like that where it's so heavily layered, where do you begin with sort of constructing each point? Because it seems like you can have the footage in front of you, but with stuff being manipulated, like the architecture of a building or the way that a plant pot is sitting, for example, is there ways that you might get tripped up in what you're doing, or even get frustrated to the point where I'm not going to work on this part, I'm going to work on this next part of the building, so that I can kind of restart with the building of the area?
Each shot in each kind of work is its own challenge. So the fact that these were all the same, what I did is I would just go through in passes and just look at one area. And sometimes you can get away with looking at the whole shot and judging it in that regard, but usually I like to break it down into sections. So, oh, this part over here had to be rotoed. So literally someone was cutting out one frame at a time, hopefully not one frame at a time, but often it devolves to that. And are there any slip ups? How's the edge of this roto? And maybe doing another pass looking at, oh, this was keyed. Okay, how's the key? Is there any chattering? Any sort of like little flickering bits? And I'm not looking at it creatively. That's what David is doing. And we don't have a VFX supervisor on this movie, which is remarkable given how many shots we have. That's because David Fincher, he is the VFX supervisor, essentially. And he is on set. We don't have any visual effects people on set because he's there. He's saying, yes, I think we're going to need this. We're going to need that. These plates would be good. Get this kind of LiDAR, or Eric Messerschmidt is getting LiDAR. And he's also reviewing all of these shots, and he is approving or declining or giving lots of notes, or eventually giving no notes and approval. And just the technical aspect of it, he trusts us to look at it. And so I try to look at it with a microscope, and I know no one's going to look at that with a microscope. It's a 1 second shot that plays in the theater for 1 second, and before you know it, you're on to the next shot. But I'm looking at these plants, and are these plants rattling at the same rate as the windows are rattling? Or is this lamp, is the color of this lamp staying the same before and after? Because I know our colorist is going to be as picky about this. We're all trying to channel this meticulousness that Fincher has. We're all trying to channel that so that he can save that energy for his other notes.
I still think that's crazy that he's on set without a VFX supervisor. I know
It is.
he has a VFX background, but it's still to think that, like, as a director, you have so much going on in your mind in terms of directing actors or how camera movement is, and talking to the various departments to make sure that you can make the day. But then not having that not having that extra person then beside you to help you with it is pretty crazy.
Yeah, I can't speak to the big VFX films that he's done, like Benjamin Button. I believe they did have someone there for that, and certainly has conversations about some of these things. But most of the shots that he ends up doing are, we'll put a matte painting in the background here. We'll paint out these imperfections in the wall here. or we'll add an airplane later. And he understands the process really well. To talk to him is crazy how much he knows about cameras, how much he knows about lenses and visual effects. And he used to work in ILM. I think that was his first film job back in the day. And he has he is able to call for visual effects and mostly knows what it entails, and even modern effects. And we've not for this movie, but he has called for can we try some AI focusing on this shot? Does How does that work? Does it What kind of results will that give us? And we've played around with some of that. And so he's trying to stay current on all that stuff because it impacts how he can shoot it and what he can shoot. And for him, it works really well. And yeah, I agree. It sounds like a lot to manage, a lot to for one person to do, but he loves the control that it gives him. And same with the stabilization. He knows how that works, and he knows he needs to get it to a certain point on set and what he can get away with in post production. And he may not know how to attach the keys in After Effects, but he that's what we're there for. Is he trusts us to do that?
I'm still trying to wrap my head around it all. But then I guess when you're a director and you're so technologically driven and versed, I guess you're always going to push what you can do and what you can't do. And as you mentioned as well, you may not know how to press the keys on the computer, sorry, to get what he wants communicated. He knows exactly what he wants and how to sort of get there and achieve it. Or, why don't we try this and see if this works at times as well.
Exactly. Yeah. His job is to ask, can we do this? And then that's done, and he sees the results. And so now he knows that he can ask for that. And I think there's a huge VFX illiteracy in Hollywood. And that's where the don't worry, we'll fix it in post comes from, is this magic wand that you wave and it will get fixed. Well, yes, it appears that way. And sometimes you don't see the blood, sweat, and tears that go into that. But the most important thing to learn there is, oh, if you had only done it this way, it would have made it half as difficult. If the monitor was not static, but instead was some sort of color that you can sort of agree the final will be. So like a monitor being on as white, and then you want to put black background with some text over top. It's going to be very difficult to sell that because the scene and your actors are illuminated by the bright white screen. So being able to commit to those things, that's a lesson that I think every director should invest the time in learning, because it will make their films better technically, but also make it a lot easier to make, which will make it just make everyone's lives better. It'll make the product better, and it'll save you money. But it's also a lot to learn, and it's a constantly evolving field.
Yes, and I guess as well, like just how technology changes so quickly, especially when it comes to filming. As we've seen with stuff like the volume, where you don't even need to go on location. And I'm sure if we have a conversation 5 years time, there'll be something else, or that's come up. That's the next big thing, or even certain other aspects that have improved.
Absolutely.
Technology wise, which I guess because we live in such a fast paced environment as well when it comes to new toys that people are constantly thinking up of how to improve tech and how it can aid us more. It feels like a little bit like we might be heading into that sort of Wall-E world, the Pixar film, where we won't need to sort of go outside eventually, or whatever.
That's somewhat true, but there's also something to be said about doing it practical. We're just trying to imitate what the real world is, and film is definitely never the real world, even if you shoot it for real.
Yeah, that's true. I guess there's always those, what is it, like it maybe not giveaways, because giveaways are let's know that we like tells that it's not like that, and that there's certain things there that you could just tell that you're in a film rather than the real world. Whilst we sort of already talking about the craft of certain scenes, let's go just back to the beginning. How did the project come about, and what made you want to take it on? From my research, you worked on Mindhunter and on Mank. Was it a case of just getting a call and being like, "Look, we're bringing the band back together. We need you. We need you by our side."
Sort of, yeah. I was working in the office on Boar and Love, Death, Robots. So one episode of Love, Death, Robots and two episodes of Boar, doing conform and visual effects. And they were bringing the killer online. And so I was there for the early meetings where they couldn't even announce the name of the camera, where they first said, yeah, we think we want to do HDR workflow end to end. And there were 5 assistants that worked on the film, and 2 of them began, myself and Jennifer. We started right at the beginning, and the others were working on other projects, still working on the other projects. And so I helped get the first several dailies labs online. So I was there as an assistant editor as opposed to a VFX editor at first, because there was no visual effects to do. And so that's why I've been working on it for so long. And that's kind of been the way that I've been working since Mindhunter. I was hired on Mindhunter as a post PA, and that was, I knew someone. I just moved to LA from Albuquerque, and I knew someone who worked on House of Cards. I knew someone who knew someone who worked on House of Cards. So I bought him lunch, and he said, well, maybe I can ask you to help out with the film. I proved that I was able to, that I was a good worker, that I knew what I was doing. And he recommended me to Peter Mavromates, who's a post producer. And he was just starting to look for a post PA. The timing worked out perfectly. And I know that's like the second to worst answer I can give you, right? The worst is nepotism. And I don't know the name for it, but yeah, a friend of a friend, hire a friend of a friend. But so much of my experience has been, that's the preferable way of hiring people, is that you have someone who vouches for someone else, and you have some sort of inclination that this person knows what they're doing or can learn what they're doing. And I feel like that's both film and just the real life. Real life. That's how people are hired. Is there's no job posting that I applied for. Might be easier that way for someone who's coming into it, but I just worked on things, met people, and I ended up at Fincher's Camp, and I worked my way up from a post PA to a apprentice, an assistant. I worked in DI for all of Mindhunter, but I was really interested in visual effects. So on Mank, I switched over to that, and every show has been a very different experience for me, and it's been fantastic. And on this one, rebuilt a database from scratch, and because tracking visual effects is a huge part of this job, and especially on a job like this where multiple vendors are involved on each shot, on a whole bunch of the shots. And it's been very interesting, and even moving forward to some of the remasters that are potentially happening, they're all just very different experiences, and just very happy to have been there for, I think it's 7.5 years at this point.
When it comes to stuff like when people vouch for you, and I guess lack of a better term, nepotism, because sometimes as you said, that like sometimes it's easier to hire someone if they vouch for them, but then at the same time it's down to that person who gets hired. Somebody's put their foot, you put your foot through the door. It is important for that door not to close on you, rather than get your whole self in, so that you're part of the project and part of the conversation of when somebody needs someone, or if there's another job coming up, and then also building up contacts from that.
It's a really strange thing where you would think that people with the same job title are competitors, but oftentimes we turn down more jobs than we accept because of timing or because of schedule. And the best answer to give of, sorry, I can't do it, but let me reach out to some people that would be willing, able, and qualified to do this, see if they're available. And so reaching out to one person is like reaching out to three. And maybe a contact of a contact is a better recommendation than just someone that has your email address and you've never met before. So as a producer, that's very nice to be able to reach out to 5 people and to know that 15 people are asked if they're available. And as a VFX editor, talking with other VFX editors, it's nice to know other people. And it's often with bigger films, it's multiple visual effects editors working because there's just so many effects and so much work to be done that it takes more than one person. So it's nice to have a lot more of those contacts. You share some strategies, you share some databases sometimes. And instead of us competing against each other, it's even at the same level. We're still collaborating, even though I've never worked with some of the people that I've recommended.
Yeah, and isn't that crazy as well that you would think that like you are competitors, that different mindset. Yeah, I can't give this job to this person because this is going to happen. But realistically, it's more to do with, here you go. I can't do it, but do you know what? This person, sorry, is just as good, and they'll be able to help you out and sort you out, and they're available now. So good luck with that. But hopefully, in the future, we can work on another project and then go from there. Really.
Yeah, and a good recommendation is better than just saying no, sorry. You're hoping, anyways. So that's what I've found with talking with other people.
Yeah, exactly. And or even somebody says, "Yeah, I know a person." It's always quite nice to also be part of the conversation, because then at least you know that you're doing something right if people are are recommending you.
Absolutely, yeah.
Back to the film itself, there was another VFX breakdown. This time it was from Wiley Co, and they did a really brilliant video of how they crafted the getaway / cleanup scene after the failed assassination attempt. The reaction online is quite astounding that people are like, I couldn't believe this was VFX. Wow, look how much is involved. I can't believe this is the a detail that's gone into it. And you, again, as an audience member, you do get blown away by the invisible work that you see in it. But when it comes to something like that, where there's so much heavy VFX work, not just on shots where you have the camera looking at a visor, but then it's also looking at the environment around it. How does this sort of thing affect your work? Does it make it harder knowing that you might need to recreate a face rather than a wall, for example?
Well, Wiley had 10 full CG shots, or rather, maybe I should say that some shots that involved big CG elements, complicated things like the experts shot in the forehead and the neck twist and the nail gun firing in Hodges. And the majority of it was in that chase from Paris that they showed. But most of the scene was practical. They attached cameras to the Vespa or to the scooter and got the tires, and a lot of it was the stunt driver riding around in Paris. And then they also took plates with this really adorable little electric car that they attach all these cameras onto. It's the most European camera car I've ever seen. I think there are pictures of it online. And that those plates were then used on an LED stage to try to get Michael Fassbender to be photographed with these LED elements. And there's behind the scenes pictures of really close up lenses on his face. And we tried to get it, I wouldn't say practically, but one step removed from practical with these LED projections, and it wasn't working. And so we had all of that material, and our VFX supervisor for those CG shots, Eric Barba, he shopped it around to different places. I think Wiley is actually the only vendor that we had never worked with before. All the other vendors, our Temple Olin Savage, our in-house team, they had at least worked on Mank and I think on Mindhunter and probably way before my time as well. So Wiley took this challenge. It was a huge amount of work. And there's these close-ups of his face, and David was asking for notes like, "Oh, the bump that you're adding right here, add it 3 frames earlier, and try to get his eyes to dart around more." Or the wind is not properly blowing the flap on his jacket collar. What if it were more like? And then he's giving suggestions there, and little things that grow into big improvements. It's just the amount of control that they have in CG. Just kind of, I think it really goes hand in hand with David's style and what he really likes, the holding the control over, but also trying to make it look realistic. And it's harder to make the CG look more realistic, and having this kind of almost practical starting point was hopefully really helpful for them. There's a lot of that is all behind the curtains, and all I know is I gave them everything that I could. They asked additional questions, tried to get them answers, but most of it was sorry, no, sorry, we don't. And then they just tried and they put it in front of David, and they got a lot of feedback. So I'd be curious to hear their perspective on it and how they handled all the notes and how they handled the starting point for all of that. But we didn't never had to do any temp VFX for that in our editorial. We did some post viz. Again, temp VFX HD versus the final 6K is a little different. You can get away with a lot more in temp VFX than you can in the final. And that's both with David's notes as well as any technical checks that we do on it.
I think as well, another thing that like maybe just doesn't come to mind in my mind is also when you're mentioning about the how the wind would flap on a jacket when somebody's riding it, which is again insane to think that like those are the sort of little details that David would be thinking about whilst working on these shots. But even when you're thinking about the shooting process of it all, how you put the cameras on the little European car, and then also to get the plates, but then also having Michael Fassbender in another studio where they'll be recording him, and then having that sort of mishmash together to bring it to the final stage as well is like, wow, like you really need to sort of be on it and really be thinking a lot about how you can merge the two sets of footages to make it seamless.
Yeah, there's all sorts of different strategies. And on Mank, we did a lot of rear projection LED things, not quite to the level of like a Mandalorian where they're moving the camera, but we had footage that was recorded, and then we went in, removed the things from the background that weren't error appropriate, stabilized where necessary, and then had that on set for playback. And we actually were recording the LED in the background. So there was no green screen or blue screen except for a couple instances. On this one, we stayed away from that. We went back to blue screen and green screen, but we kept on Mindhunter, they did this, and on this film, where the driving scenes have LED plates showing the footage that we've color corrected, stabilized in certain instances of driving at night to Dolores' house, for instance, or driving while he's eating an egg. So David's able to sit there and ask for another take. Please bring him another hard-boiled egg. And they're able to do take after take after take without being on location and having to block the street. Okay, time to turn around, drive all the way back and do it once more. And so he's able to do a lot more takes in a day with that kind of hybrid VFX setup. And he was aiming to do, and we always touch things up. Maybe the reflection in the mirror isn't, maybe it's proper, but it doesn't quite look right. Okay, we'll change that. Or we actually want the car to go a little sooner, or Fassbender turned the wheel seems like a little slow. Okay, let's move the footage faster or sooner, excuse me, so that it looks like his steering wheel lines up with the driving plate. So Dave is really able to have all that control, and I think it really pays off. And I want to emphasize that, people say he does all these takes, he does so many takes, and I really love what David said about this is he doesn't want to emphasize that point. He wants to say, what's the result of all that? And the result is that he gets a perfect performance in his eyes, a perfect performance, and he's able to choose multiple different perfect performances. And it's the same thing with visual effects. And I'm sure Dombert said the same thing about the art direction.
I think as well the point of when David does so many takes, I think there's a good example of why so many takes has happened is in the Social Network, the opening scene. I could be wrong. This is something that I've heard was that he would digitally remove the way somebody would say something and how their mouth moved from one part of the take and then put it into another part that he liked and then sort of build it up from there. Which it feels like you're creating like the most Frankenstein monster of a scene without realizing. You're not realizing. Well, no, let me change that. You're creating Frankenstein scene like without the audience realizing.
Yeah, if they don't realize, if the point of the scene is what it conveys to the audience, and if that comes across with the Frankenstein scene, then I mean that's what editing is. And I wasn't on the Social Network, so I can't speak as to a mouth replacement, but we certainly have done splits, which feels like it's in the same vein where you have a two shot, two people talking to each other, and the actors chose a certain amount of time between each delivery. Maybe the editor at that point says, let's half that time. So left actor says something, the pause is now cut in half. The right actor says something, maybe the left actor interrupts them where on set they actually didn't. Or an over the shoulder, same with the over the shoulder, though it becomes a little more complicated with the edges, and all that becomes visual effects. But we do a lot of splits, and those are ways of merging different performances, changing the timing, and it's Frankenstein in a way because it wasn't what was actually recorded on set. It's a different interpretation of that. But that's all that we do. You film something with a green screen in the background, and okay, we weren't really in Florida. We didn't shoot any of this really in Florida, but this looks like Florida, right? So we're always trying to convey that because the message is the important part.
Yes, and I think you make a really good point about well, that's how the point of editing is creating that Frankenstein to then be as a final part of the film. Yeah, that is something that kind of didn't play through my mind. So I think that's a very good point as well, and how the editing part is like that. So then the VFX will follow with that as well. If you want to build the perfect scene about what's going on.
But I think it's a good point. I think they should rename the editorial department to the Frankenstein department because it really is. But it's not Frankenbiting, which is a editorial term for. I think it's mostly reality TV show where they put words in people's mouths. Where they chop up the audio to try to have the characters say something that they didn't really say. I mean, we put words in people's mouths. It's called ADR, and off-screen ADR and voiceover. These are all things that we have control over. But the the reasoning that we do that is to convey the script, even if it's a revised script, as opposed to getting these reality TV show actors to convey something that they didn't really say.
Yeah, I
But
guess. Sorry, go on.
oh, yeah, I don't think Frankenbiting is necessarily something that we do in post production for films.
No, and I think with like reality TV, I'm not really a fan, but you understand why they would do that just to really amp up and juice up the drama of whatever reality TV show they're producing at the moment,
Exactly. Yeah.
which is like it feels like they will never run out of ideas, especially with what they're going to come up with and the wacky stuff that
Tune in
you see on
for The
TV.
Killer, the reality show.
Yeah,
No, okay. I don't think they're going to do that. They did it for Squid Game. I don't think they're doing it for the killer.
Unless it's like it's not necessarily like being killed, but like somebody's dropped into somewhere where they have to be sort of stealth and not be blend in everywhere. But then you have all these cameras everywhere, so I don't think you could really be stealth and blend in. So that's an awful idea. But please buy it off of Netflix.
They already own the rights, so
there's what I'm also curious about as well is like because you're working with editors on the film as well, the film editors. How do you guys work with one another, but make sure that your work doesn't overshadow each other? Is there a case that your workflows are very different? Have they already cut the scene and then let you work on it? Or is it the other way around that you're working on it and then for them to cut it accordingly?
I think every relation is unique there because I think every film is. But again, I still see myself as a assistant editor. So I'm working with Kirk, and sometimes we ask him, the VFX producer, and we ask him, how far along is the brute scene? When can we start giving that over to Savage? And maybe the answer is, okay, let me work with David and get, okay, well, we got through the first half and he okayed giving that to them. Okay, well, that gives me plenty of work on. There's a lot of visual effects in the brute where we want to deform the hole in the wall that he punches with his fist. We want to add particles. All that is stuff they can start working on. And as it comes back in, I'm cutting it into the main edit sequence when Kirk is not in there. And we're working in Adobe Premiere, and it's virtually identical workflow. I mean, technically, it's very different. We're dealing with XMLs, being able to import things very easily. But I'm able to cut shots in and see what they look like in the sequence. Sometimes I'm posting chunks of the edit for David so that Fincher can comment on it. And sometimes Kirk also wants to know, hey, that shot of the clouds is in. Someone thinks, usually maybe Fincher or Peter Mavromatis, they think that can you take another look at this? Does it still cut how you think it was before that effect was coming in? Or we now have blood dripping in the brute. The only blood in that whole scene that is practical is the blood that the actors have on them. All the blood that's on the ground, and especially the dripping blood. Oh, do we need to reach out to sound department? Does Skywalker need to take a look at this? Oh, it's because it's simulated or a simulation of blood. It's harder to change the timing on the side of visual effects, and David has approved this look. So the temp, blood dripping, can we rearrange those? Those are the kind of because editorial is kind of the hub of all of these departments, we're the best to say, I think this connects to this department. Let's get these two people talking, or let's see if these graphics are going to change this thing in color. Okay, can we get an alpha channel? All those kinds of communication and cooperations are really important so that something doesn't come up at the last minute and you realize you have to redo something or you have to do something in a rush.
Film is one big collaborative process, and it does take an army to make these things, which, but then also there's like the right balance of getting people to do their work, but then also you need to know when you can start doing your work and what you can be creating on and how you can make sure that you're on top of your workflow and not get behind, because I can imagine like every day that you're behind could probably create a lot of problems later on down the road, that like that little snowflake turns into a massive avalanche of like, oh crap, we could be severely delayed on certain things.
Yeah, and post-production is always the last step. And when I worked in DI, that's the last step of the last step, where if a visual effect shot is 2 days late coming in, then that's more of a rush to try to get it cut in and Does the colorist need to look at it? Does David need to look at it in context? Okay, we're rendering for final delivery. It's too late. And there's a lot of pressure that comes along with that. Luckily, David takes a long time on his movies because he has a lot of elements, a lot of things working. It takes. He's also fast about it, though. I think when you said that it takes an army, it really does. But also, David prefers to have fewer people involved in the process. He prefers, like, he doesn't want to bring a VFX supervisor in because he can do that role, and that's one fewer person that potentially could get in the way, or having to wait on that person to do their job while he is already there and can do it. And so a lot of us at Finchers, we tend to be generalist. And so I've on Mank, I did some dailies ingesting, operating. And I was trained from that to assistant editing to visual effects to conform. And that's like the whole visual spectrum, the spectrum of all the picture things. I don't have nearly the experience with sound, but so I can't speak to that at all. But as far as I'm trained on doing all of that pipeline, so I can train anyone to do that. Or if someone's out sick, I can step in and do that. Or I know that, oh, because conform will probably require this, it's better if visual effects asks for those alpha channels now and then marries them in the EXR as opposed to having a sidecar file. Those kind of things, that's based on the preference of the colorist, so it might change. But having that specialty versus general specialist, I prefer being more general. It's also, I think, way more interesting. Like, you have different challenges every day.
I think there's also like you become a very, jack of all trades, and I guess when you're working when you're working together, and the fact that you could step in to do this or step in to do that, or if somebody is explaining something that you might need to change, you kind of understand where they're coming from, because if there's someone in a specific role explaining something, you know where you're coming from because you understand what it entails. And I think when they talk about David Fincher not having a VFX supervisor and being that himself, it probably helps as well in terms of the dialogue between people, that he kind of cuts out that middle person. For then he can just go to people directly and say, yeah, if you do this, if you do that, if you change this, you can change that. That might help with just getting things done, and also just sort of going to people directly.
Yeah, I definitely agree. I think because he emphasizes he's a generalist as well, that he knows a little of a whole bunch of things. And he's very eloquent in his speech, and he's very direct, and you put something in front of him and he will give you a note. He will have feedback on it one way or the other. And just him knowing a little of everything encourages us to also have that attitude, because it really does help sometimes. Specialists are really good at what they do, but they often can't see outside of their own realm. So a camera operator doesn't need to know about stabilization, but if they do, then they might know that it's more important that we don't have motion blur as opposed to them following the framing perfectly, because we can fix the framing because now we don't have that motion blur to it. But a good camera operator who doesn't have to do stabilization is probably just going to do the best tracking job that they can, which may not go upstream as well as someone who knows the whole process.
And I guess also just makes it easier, maybe not easier, but just the get a better understanding of what needs to be done and what happens on the day as well. With, if, as you said, if people know how certain things work as well. Just to come up to with my penultimate question, what was your favorite scene to work on?
I think probably Hodges. I know everyone answers the brute fight, but all the scenes that had heavy visual effects, such as the intro, the target shooting or the brute. Those are all scenes that I've looked at a lot. But Hodges is also has a fair number of visual effects, but they're all a lot more simple, a lot more reminiscent of like a Mindhunter. I suppose you could even call it a monologue, but his angles are changing all the time. He has all these stabilizations. They're nice long shots for the stabilization. And then Olin added the nails once that moment happens. Wiley did the close up on the shot. And there's a bunch of things in there that no one's ever going to see: set extensions, stabilizations, split screens. But most of it is straightforward. And I just really love his performance. Everyone's performance in it, but especially Charles Parnell.
Yeah,
And I
that's
still say, I need email time. I need my email time.
I think that's a very solid choice. I think that is I think that's it's a scene that I don't feel like people mention as much compared to other scenes, and I think maybe that's because of maybe it doesn't feel like it's a very like show off moment in terms of the film. You know, like how you have the beginning, you have the killer overlooking the building or the brutes fight scene, or even when you're with Tilda Swinton and having those sort of moments. This one's a more of a I don't know. It feels like a more of a smaller scene, but very chaotic because things have been miscalculated, and it's also just like, what's going to happen here, or what's happened here because of the killer's mistake.
Yeah, it's two calculations gone awry. Both of them make the mistakes. And yeah, that killer gets away scot-free though in the end. And also
Yeah,
the whole sequence leading up to it is also it was fun to see it evolve and grow, and adding the sound effects of the door to really try to help drive that moment in as a temp sound. I remember how that really helped the scene, and that was David asking for that. But then I can't help but think of all the reflections that I looked at to make sure that there were no cameras being reflected. I just can't get that out of my mind of all the process for what I've done for the last 2 years.
do you ever catch yourself looking at like reflections in real life and being like, no, getting like PTSD from when you're working on it?
I certainly remember like big discussions with our in-house VFX where we're trying to get any sort of reflective surface, saying, okay, so the camera is filming this rear view mirror, but that's capturing this reflection. So would that be forwards or backwards? Would the text now be legible? And we're like trying to hold up mirrors, but that's the level that we're trying to get to. Is perhaps some people would say, oh, whatever, it's a sign, it's in a mirror, so it's backwards. Versus us saying, well, actually, I think it was photographed this way. So what would the light really be doing, or how could we fake this in a more convincing way? And I try not to let that seep into real life, but it's really hard to not let that seep into watching other films. But certainly watching as much stabilization as I've seen, I have a hard time turning it off when I'm watching other media.
Yeah, fair enough. I think I think as well when you're working on so many different things at the same, I guess when you work on so many things, you kind of realize how, I don't know, you just, I guess you kind of become more, you notice things more, and you also don't want to be taken out of the film. But I guess if you also have such a very strong eye on things, it does make it very difficult to enjoy it, and sometimes be like, well, I don't want to be taken out of this because of this, or vice versa.
Yeah, I mean, I'm paid to try and find the mistakes in the visual effect shots, or try to dissect how they were made so I can see if all the elements are proper and how it compares to the original. And I can't do that very easily by watching a film, but it's hard to turn off, but it's important to be able to turn it off to enjoy other media.
Yeah, exactly. I wonder if musicians have the same thing when they listen to other artists' music and be like, is this correct? I'm not sure.
It's a very good point. I bet they struggle with that as well.
Probably more than likely, yeah. And then just to hit up with my final question, how have you found the reaction to the film? I know we spoke about it where you were watching it in a full cinema, but have people reached out and spoken to you about it and said, oh, man, like how did they do this? What happened here? How does this work?
Well, yeah, I saw it once in theaters, and it had a very limited theatrical run. But I've lost all objectivity to it, having seen it so many times. But I'm glad to see that some people are appreciating it. It might be a little more straightforward than Fincher's other work, but it still has that high level of detail that we try to we try to uphold. And I love to see different. I love to read the list of goofs or the FAQs, those kind of things, to see what mistakes other people have caught, and what, I feel like it's part of like, oh, we missed this or we missed that. And the problems that I might have with some of the shots or some of the scenes, it's no one else has had those problems. So it just shows that when you're living in the process, you have definitely a different sense of importance of what needs to be fixed. And then people are saying, oh, in Florida they don't sell liquor bottles in the amount that killer buys for the brute. Like, well, how can you even consider looking that one up? And that's something that I guess the production designer or prop master would have looked up, and or the researcher on Mank. We definitely hired a researcher because we're doing so many historical things. But it's really funny to see someone who lives in Florida and knows those are the rules look at that bottle of Old English and say, you can't buy that in Florida. So that's very amusing. But it's fun to see that people are enjoying it. And again, it certainly is. It's maybe not receiving the same accolades as like a Mindhunter, but I had the same exact feeling on Mindhunter. I thought, oh, no one's gonna like this. I don't know why. I've worked on this for a year and a half, and then it comes out and people love it. I've just seen this way too many times. I'm serial killered out. I guess I should give it a couple years and revisit it. I might change my mind.
If just to let you know, I absolutely love Mindhunter, and it's a shame that it hasn't come back again. But it is what it is, and yeah, hopefully one day they'll do some sort of video or something where they will talk about how, yeah, they'll talk about how what they would have done with Mindhunter, the next series. But yeah, there we are. But also
It's
going
never
back,
too late. They caught BTK in I think 2010, so they can do a skip forward in time to catch him, or hire another director. I have no idea. That's all between the studio and the director.
that's actually a really good idea, though, which I think again, Netflix, you know who to call. Um, but the going back to how you were saying about the goofs and whatnot, I just think it's just funny how people pick up on these things, that even though, oh, you might not buy this thing, you might not get this, it's just like there's always going to be that one person who will go through it all and make sure will pick up on these things. And it's just, I guess it's quite funny for you guys to read, but then also might be like, oh, we should have picked up on that.
Yeah, there were some things that, oh, we should have fixed that, or and we knew about this, but it didn't rise to the level of we need to fix it. But then, everyone always talks about the Game of Thrones cup or bottle or whatever. And the thing is, they do so much work on that, and I'm sure they catch so many things, and one thing slips, and it's not a scene that has heavy visual effects, and that's what people talk about instead of how incredible the CGI dragons are and how amazing all the crowd replacement work is. And that's unfortunate, but it's also, no, it's not really a VFX editor's job. It's a QC, so quality control. And just like all the things, we send our movie out to quality control, and they look at different, they're looking for some of those things. I don't think they're looking at Florida law to see what the size of the container is or in what state this supermarket is part of, but they are looking at for more technical. And yeah, we were aware that the internet talks and how the internet talks, and it's really funny to see like David Fincher finding an article and saying, "Hey, is this true? Is this really happening?" For something that relates to him. He's like, surprise, now you know. Or no, that's just a rumor. So how many headlines have come out saying Mindhunter season 3 is greenlit? None of them are true.
I can always imagine like it's like the Homer Simpson going reversed into the bushes meme, not meme, GIF, sorry,
Yeah,
of like, when is this true? He's like, and then you just guys sort of like disappear backwards. But I guess, as I said, there'll always be something, and there'll always be things that'll be pointed out about it all.
it's fun for them. So it's fun for
Uh,
us as well. No, it's too late to work on
it's like, oh, we can't do that. We can't fix it in post. So enjoy,
it.
guys.
Well, you can a little bit. Just look at the what was that movie that was criticized for having a lens flare that people thought was a dead pixel in the center? Army of the Dead.
Oh, really? I didn't know that story. I'm gonna Google that once we're finished here.
That's an
Um,
interesting one because everyone complained about it on Twitter when it was called that. And it got such kickback that they went ahead and fixed it. So if you watch it now on Netflix, it is not the same final as what was originally criticized.
well,
So it does have some impact.
all right. I'll make sure I'll have a look and read through that, because I'm just curious if that's going to be the case. Well, it is the case. Sorry, I would be curious to know what people's thinking and criticism about it, or about how a lens flare could look like a dead pixel. So, there must be some sort of like science or mind thing that goes into it for people to sort of clock that in their head when they're watching.
Yeah, it's fascinating. And we were interested because we fixed a lot of dead pixels, especially on Mindhunter. And if we had left them in, would people have caught them? And once you put enough work into something as minor as a single pixel or a clump of pixels, you wonder if people are going to notice. And then here's a big example of people complaining about dead pixels, even though it wasn't. It was like some sort of lens, I believe.
All right, I'll have to read up on that. Casey, thank you so much for your time today. The Killer is streaming now on Netflix. Go out, watch Casey's work and others that worked with him, and enjoy it.
Thank you so much. Well, while you're here, we'll listen to some other podcasts from Bobby here.
Yeah, I'll take the shout out. Yeah. Thank you very much. You
Thank you
take
so much for
care.
having me.
Bye bye.
Bye.
Thank you for listening. Please subscribe, rate, and review this podcast.